So welcome everyone. It's good to see you, and I appreciate you being here this evening. I'm looking forward to this time together. I'm Robert Schnase, Bishop of the Rio, Texas, and the New Mexico Annual Conferences, and it is a privilege for me to be here today. And I just give God thanks for you and for your interest and curiosity and investment in the United Methodist Church. We're not here to argue or debate. I'm not here to persuade you about anything. I'm here to answer some questions and give an overview of General Conference first and some of the elements that will be coming before General Conference. And then after that, spend a little more time about the New Mexico Conference and some of the things in our future there. So that's kind of the flow of this. You've been given cards, and if you want to write down a question toward the end of this, there'll be a chance for, we'll gather those that have those cards. There'll be some sorting, and we'll probably be able to take 5 or 6 questions or something, and so we won't be able to take all the questions, but that's a little bit of the design of the evening. I just welcome you to Central United Methodist Church, and Andy, thank you for the hospitality to your staff and your lay ministers, your everyday disciples who've helped create this atmosphere of hospitality. I want to begin by reading a scripture that's from Ephesians, the 4th chapter, a few select verses. I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And then moving down a couple of verses. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, who is above all and through all and in all. The gifts we were given is that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. To equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all things come to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. May God bless us with this word this evening. So I look at those lines, to equip the saints for the building up of the body of Christ. And how do we do that in this current era, this current circumstance? It's so easy to kind of to focus on the past and maybe the losses of these last couple of years. But we still have the same task, and that's to equip people for the ministry of Christ. That remains the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That never changes, and that's the key to our purpose and to our future. When I served, by the way, I have someone here who's a retired pastor from the old Southwest Texas Conference that's moved up to New Mexico, and he and I were ordained together back 117 years ago. So he knows the church I'm about to talk about. So I remember being assigned to a church that had been on this kind of long, slow decline and slowly aging for decade after decade. And I was 31 years old and assigned. It was a pretty large responsibility. And so what was I going to do, and how was I going to get oriented on things? What were the priorities going to be? How do we start working on things? And one of the things that just haunted me was this picture that they had that was a photograph from somewhere in the middle of the 1950s. And it was the men's Bible class, First Methodist Church in McAllen. And it's in the gymnasium, and there's probably 300 men in black suits and ties. And I'm preaching in my first year there to about 180 people. Now, over time, things went very well and that congregation thrived. But I always kept looking at that, and whenever I'd see that picture, I'd be thinking about all the people who aren't there. And it kind of moves to this scarcity mentality, right? We don't have the money. We don't have the people to do what God's calling us to do. Well, I want to begin tonight by saying we have exactly the right amount of money and the right number of people and the right gifts to do what God is calling us to do right now in this moment. We may not have the same, we may not have all the money and all the people to do ministry as it was done in 1955 and to fill a gymnasium with 400 men, right? But we have exactly what we need now. There's a passage, this is Peterson's The Message translation, and it's about Jesus sending out the disciples. This is the scene from Luke. And he says, Jesus called the 12, gave them authority and power to deal with all the demons and heal diseases. He gave them authority. He commissioned them to preach the news of God's kingdom and heal the sick. He said, don't load yourselves up with equipment. Keep it simple. You are the equipment. Now, I've always liked his spin on things there. That, he tells not to take this with you, don't carry back, you don't, but what he says is God has given you everything you need to fulfill the ministry of this commissioning. And so that's the spirit in which I look at this time in our church's life. Do I lament some of the losses? Have I lost friends in this that I never imagined it would go that way? Have people said things that have been hurtful? Have I perhaps said things that I didn't realize were hurtful? But we've got to move out of that scarcity mentality and realize that we've been entrusted with the ministry of Christ. And our job is to equip the saints for the fulfilling of the mission that is before us right now. I give God thanks for every one of you and all that you do for the purposes of Christ and for the United Methodist Church. Le doy gracias a Dios por cada uno de ustedes y por todo lo que hacen para la misión de Cristo y la misión de la Iglesia Metodista Unida. And so now we're going to start talking about General Conference. So it looks like there's a mistake on that slide. We're going to hold the 2020 General Conference in May of 2024. Only in Methodism. So this is the postponed General Conference from 2020, which means all the petitions and the legislative work that was being prepared for the 2020 General Conference will now be taken to the 2024 General Conference, as well as other petitions that have been received more recently. So it's going to be quite a show, I think. It looks like that's like 10 days long, right? I have to be there 3 weeks for meetings before and meetings afterwards. I'm not asking for your sympathy, but I just, although a little wouldn't hurt. So the work of General Conference that takes place every 4 years, it does any number of things, but as far as its decision making, it's basically 800, 900 people gathering from all over the world to revise and update the Book of Discipline. This is the most recent one that was published in 2016, so we're missing the 2020, right? And some people think, well, when they're going to gather, I've seen things, I'm afraid Some people show me things on the internet that I'd just rather not see, but I've seen people say, well, they're going to do away with the Trinity, or they're going to take the resurrection out of the, out of the doctrine, or something like that. The interesting thing about General Conference is it doesn't change doctrine, it addresses polity. So it changes paragraphs that have to do with how we do our work and how we do our ministry. And so, yes, United Methodists are going to believe in God and in Jesus and in the Holy Spirit. And so this is all going to be about changes in how we do our work together. And there are times I'm looking forward to General Conference. I think the first General Conference I ever attended was 1988, which tells you something about Scott and my age. And I've had to give up predicting what General Conference was going to do, because every General Conference does something that makes me smile, and every General Conference does something that breaks my heart. And this one will probably have some elements of both, but I hope it's more of something that makes me smile than something that breaks my heart. So we're going to start with we're going to talk about 5 issues here, and we could have started at any kind of direction here, but I decided to start with the proposal for a U.S. regional conference. And that map up there, all the yellow areas are areas where there is no kind of organized United Methodist churches as a denomination. All the other colors are United Methodist conferences and regions, Episcopal areas and the like. So you see the United States, those differing colors are the different jurisdictions in the United States. You see Europe, and then you see Eastern Europe that extends the bishop of Russia, covers the area of Russia. And then you see the Northern Africa up there, that's actually part of one of the European conferences. And then you see all the conferences in Africa. When General Conference meets, it has delegates, 850 to 900 delegates, and about 45% of those come from outside the United States. Mostly from Africa, a good number from the Philippines, and then smaller numbers from Europe and very small numbers from Eastern Europe, okay? The idea of a U.S. regional conference is to create a conference that will meet once every so many years, probably 4 years, that will focus on U.S. matters that only pertain and affect the United States Church. Well, why would we want to do that by ourselves? And well, number one, the proposal is that it would be all the U.S. delegates from all the conferences and the jurisdictions, but it would also be one pastor and one layperson from every annual conference around the world. So there'd still be a significant number of people from around the world. But it would deal just with matters that impact the United States. And why would we want to do this? Number one, it's giving the United States the same authority that Africa has for the African conferences, and that the Philippines has for the Philippine conferences, and that Europe has for the European conferences. They can gather as a conference without the U.S., without everybody else, just among themselves, and they can make changes in polity, in the practice of their ministry, while not changing doctrinal elements and those things that kind of go to the core of our global church. But the U.S. hasn't had that ability to do that. But here's the real reason why this is important. Because when you go to General Conference and you look at all the legislation, there's this huge percentage, and I'm kind of making this number up, but it's like 60-70% of what is voted on and amended in legislative committees and then voted by General Conference are only applicable to the United States. Well, why is that the case? Well, so I chair the board of directors of WestPath, which is the $25 billion pension program for United Methodist clergy and lay people that has 100,000 people that it covers. It's based in Chicago, and so everything about the operation of that board has to meet various criteria for incorporation in Illinois. It also has to meet, because you're dealing with $25 billion, with all kinds of regulations about pension plans, fiduciary responsibilities, legal issues, and then you can take other parts of the Book of Discipline too, not just about WestPath, but all the parts of the Book of Discipline that talk about property matters, how you sell and buy property and all those. That's all based on U.S. law, and it's in U.S. language for those things. Things about safe sanctuary, the protection of children. I could go on and on with those things. So you go to the Pensions Legislative Committee at General Conference, or you go to the financial one. You can go to almost any of them, and so much of the work is just U.S. centric. That's some of what's behind the regional conference idea, is that we would be able, as the U.S. church, to make decisions that are specific to the U.S. How would this happen? It would happen in two stages. This general conference, if those petitions were adopted, would form a committee that starts to work on the first gathering of a U.S. conference and how that would work. And then stage two would actually be holding a regional conference with U.S. delegates, as well as I said, a pastor and a lay person from each of the other annual conferences around the world. The proposal makes no changes in doctrine, no changes to how bishops are elected, no changes to the jurisdictional structure. The U.S. would remain in connection to the global church. So that's some of what's behind that, and it would reduce costs significantly, because the meeting of the whole general conference, when it comes together, could be just a fraction of the length of time, because you wouldn't have people from all over the world staying for 12 days to work on things, much of which wasn't particularly relevant to them. So that's the first thing just to be aware of. There are places on different UMC websites where you can get up-to-date information about this. Allie, the conference communications person, is going to be putting some stuff on the website that kind of are places where you can explore a little further and a little deeper. Let's go to the next issue of General Conference. And I tried to figure out what to name this one, and I ended up just naming it Book of Discipline Changes. Now, as I said earlier, that's all that General Conference actually does as far as concrete work. And so it makes little adjustments throughout the whole Book of Discipline, except for the doctrinal things. But what I'm referring here to, which I think is kind of front of everybody's mind, is what is the General Conference? What are the petitions going to be related to LGBT inclusion? So a little bit of background. There's been restrictive language that goes back for probably 25, 30 years, limiting the participation of LGBT persons in different parts of ministry, or for offering themselves for ordained ministry. But through a progression of general conferences, things just kept tightening things up. And so there'd be more punitive, there'd be more restrictions on, and of course back when these debates first started, there was hardly conversation of civil unions, let alone weddings. But as things changed in our culture, it brought up more questions. Can clergy perform those? Can they be present at them? Can they, and so forth. So the purpose of a called session in 2019 was to receive a report from the Commission on a Way Forward, which was a very diverse, most diverse group I ever served on. I was one of the, I forget how many members, but 26 members or something like that. And we had people from all over the globe, but we all had people across the theological spectrum. And we worked long and hard to come to some solution to break through the block that was going on between those who wanted to change the language, those who wanted to maintain the language. What was proposed at General Conference was the one church model, which I'm happy to say I had a big hand in composing that. I think to most people's surprise and shock, that kind of, because that would have given room and space for contextual ministry. So if you were in a context where, and of the heart, that it was appropriate to do a same-sex wedding, you could do it, but you would never be mandated to do it. You were never going to be required to do it, in the same way with how churches operated and conferences and everything. That was voted down, and this is where the shock came into most people, is there was a vote that was 53% to 47% at that 2019 meeting in St. Louis to adopt a pretty intense and restrictive traditionalist plan. And this was the result of some very concerted efforts by conservative activists in the U.S. in conjunction with especially the conferences in Africa and the Philippines and other places in the world. The vote to adopt that plan was 438 to 384 out of 822 votes. Part of what especially many Christians, United Methodists in the U.S. had to get their minds around is how kind of countercultural to our current context that is in so many places in the United States, right? So the proposals that are coming before General Conference in 2024 are mostly proposals to remove the restrictive language, okay? And when I say restrictive language, you might be thinking of, incompatibility statement that's been in the Book of Discipline for many, many years. But in 2019, what changed is this more restrictive and punitive language. And what is in this book that I held up a minute ago is the 2016. That's the Book of Discipline you have in your church study or your superintendent carries with them. But none of what I'm going to describe here from 2019 is in that because it hasn't been revised yet, but it is church law right now. That as it currently stands, the church cannot license or commission or ordain self-avowing practicing homosexuals. The Board of Ordained Ministry must, anyone to serve on the Board of Ordained Ministry must certify that they will uphold that disciplinary requirement. The bishop is required to rule any Board of Ordained Ministry recommendation out of order that lifts someone up who is described in that language. The district committee is prohibited from approving or licensing anyone. Ministers cannot preside at same-sex weddings or union services. And they can't be conducted in our churches or in our chapels, in church-related institutions like universities, Methodist universities, or hospitals. And where it really kind of intensified in 2019 is the consequences of violating this. So if a pastor, doesn't matter if it's a brand new pastor, someone who has 40 years experience, if they perform a same-sex wedding, they're immediately suspended for 1 year without pay. Okay? And then if they perform another wedding, they're removed from ministry. Now remember, I'm the guy who worked on the one church plan, so I still believe in a church where people could hold different interpretations of Scripture and convictions, and that they can honor one another and respect one another as long as they're not doing harm to one another, right? What I think is going to happen because of the disaffiliations in the U.S., that shifts the balance of things in the U.S. delegations at General Conference. And also because in reaction to 2019, many annual conferences elected a different mix of delegates. So in many of our conferences, and I could start down the list, in this jurisdiction, it became younger and more moderate and progressive clergy and laity. So there's going to be a different mix going to this General Conference than in 2019. The other thing that's still uncertain is there's a lot of conflict in Africa, and there's a lot of conversation in the Philippines, and there may be some delegations that do not attend General Conference from some of those conferences. So it feels like it's very likely that the language will come out, the restrictive language. Like I said, I've stopped making bets. Well, wait, I'm a bishop, I don't make bets. But, and if it does, if the language comes out, I hope it's removal of the language and not replacement of the language. Now, what do I mean by that? I hope it doesn't still have some howevers and buts and that kind of thing that are hiddenly restricted. But I also hope that it doesn't kind of swing to the other end with language that says, if you're an ordained pastor, you must perform weddings and this kind of thing. Leave it to pastoral prerogative and discernment. That's where it rests. And leave it to local churches to think about their own ministries. Leave it to conference boards of ordained ministry to discern who's called to ministry and who has the gifts for serving in the context of that conference. So another element coming up before General Conference is a revision of the social principles of the United Methodist Church. This is what it looks like. So this runs 39 pages. Now, if you're kind of aware, I know people have different levels of experience gathered here. Of the Book of Discipline has had the social principles in it for several generations now, in one form or the other. As a matter of fact, the first, what was it called? Social Creed, yes, was in 1908. And that was in the Northern Church, as the churches were separated from the South. But in pretty short order, the Southern Church also had a social creed. And what that creed did back in the day is it was a reminder of the ethical responsibilities and Christian duty of people to care for people who are, the language wouldn't have been used this way back then, but marginalized, for the poor, for those who are downtrodden. I mean, it would have 1908 language in it, but it was to attend to the least and the lost. It was language that reminded us of our social responsibility. So it was, and as that matured and changed over the decades, it was, it's been revised over and over. But it was the 2012 General Conference that commissioned the Board of Church and Society to work out a way to offer a new revision of it that was more global in consciousness, that was more succinct, and that was more relevant to the current age. And they set to work on that and put it in the legislation, finished their project. It was an amazing project. I think they had I want to say, I forget where I read this, but it's like 4,000 people were consulted in the writing of this. And then there were 6 writing teams of a global nature that worked on this, and then it had various editorial steps. And it was to be presented at the 2020 General Conference, which we'll have in a few months. And so I took some time this morning to just read through it again, and a few things that strike me. By the way, when I'm eating social principles, it kind of gives a theological and biblical foundation toward positions on global warming, food justice, globalization, income inequality, human trafficking, corruption, corporate responsibility, human sexuality, divorce, substance abuse, marriage, pornography, reproductive health, criminal justice, the elderly, migrants, and so forth. And the social principles are not like a law of the church, that you must believe these things to be United Methodist, but they're meant to stimulate deliberative reflection about our responsibilities. What I like about the newly written social principles is it relies much more on actual quotes from John Wesley and biblical quotes, biblical references. And that's kind of cool that we not only kind of draw our roots back to 1908, but all the way back to Wesley himself, looking at how active he was in social justice issues back in the day. So it addresses some of these subjects with greater elaboration, that's kind of in more relevant language to this generation. It identifies contemporary issues that had not been addressed in previous editions of the social principles. And so when I reread it, the social principles, I experienced what I experience every time I've read the social principles in times past, is I go from one to one, kind of quietly nodding, and then I go, because there'll be something in there that makes me uncomfortable, that challenges me, that stretches me, that pushes me one way or another, right? And that's part of the purpose of the social principles, is to get us to think afresh about our own assumptions and our own practices in the lives we lead, not just within the church, but in the context of the global community. So I encourage you to look that up. It's intended to start a kind of deliberative reflection and then to be used in teaching about biblical and theological foundations for addressing some of these issues. The next significant issue I'm going to visit about is Westpath The General Board of Pensions, as I said, it's a $26 billion operation, 280 full-time employees, professionals in Chicago. Every annual conference has a conference benefits officer that works with the pensions programs in that conference. About 100,000 people, their pension, and for many of them, their health insurance is related to this. But and those of us who are clergy in this, or if you're a lay employee who's been contributing to Westpath, you may be familiar with terms like the Pre-82 plan. That was a defined benefit plan. Pre-82 means for every service year before 1982, you get a benefit that is voted by the conference that you were serving at that time for however many years you were serving there. Pre-82, this is another age thing, Scott. I have a 1/2 year credit from the Southwest Texas Conference from 1981. And so every monthly kind of pension statement, it has the other more up-to-date pension funds and things like that. And then there's this little thing that's voted on by the annual conference every year that's 1/2 year's pension credit from the Southwest Texas Conference for 1981. And that, with that, I'll be able to visit, when I retire, visit Starbucks probably twice a year. So then there was the MPP, Ministerial Pension Plan, the Clergy Retirement and Security Program, CRISP, CRSP. These all had components that are kind of defined benefit, but also defined contribution, and kind of moving toward more defined contribution. Westpath is proposing, and has put a lot of work into this, the adoption of a new pension plan called Compass that moves the plan going forward to all defined contribution. Why are they doing this? They're trying to address various concerns. One is the long-term sustainability of these funds. If you do the, what's it called? The actuarial, yes, that's right. When I took those little tests in high school about what you ought to be in the future, actuarial, archivist, accountant, just don't work with people, put him in a room, give him some numbers. God's full of laughter and good humor. But where was I? Actuarial, that was right. So if you actually do the actuarial charts of the pension program from 2024 and the obligations that right now Westpath has, the tail of that projection out is more than 100 years away. And you think, how can that be? Well, it happens when someone very young now grows to be much older and then marries someone younger than themselves. And all of a sudden you've got, and then they have children, and it gets extended way out there. So by moving to a defined, not a defined benefit, where you're guaranteed a certain amount for every year you serve, to a defined contribution, it helps protect and keep that tail healthy far out into the future. And but then it accomplishes, the Compass plan accomplishes some other things. One of those is this is going to have an element in it that further helps especially equalize or assist low-income clergy. So there's going to be a certain basic fee that's pretty low that churches pay regardless of their size for every pastor, okay? And that standardization helps create a better future for the lowest paid people in the ministry. It also is changing up some of the rules about how you can use your benefits. I should reword that. What happens to your benefits when you're no longer the beneficiary? Meaning you finish your course in faith. There are elements of, you're less laughing, Dustin. Many aspects of the current plans, when the pastor dies and the pastor's spouse's survivor dies, then there's no other beneficiaries that receive anything. This is going to address some of that so that things can be passed from one generation after another after meeting all the retirement requirements. What else? This is going to have an element in it that assists pastors in paying down qualified student loans. That's something we didn't have to think about that much 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but now is a very big deal for pastors. And so those are some of the advantages of it. It was supposed to be adopted at the 2020 General Conference and start taking effect in 2022. Because of the delay, it changes even some of the numbers and things and some of the calculations, and so some elements of the plan had to be tweaked a little bit. This is still going to be the 2020 General Conference, but if it's adopted in 2024, it will go into effect in 2026. I'm trying to think if there's anything else up there to look at. So just an example, if a clergy person is enrolled in 2024, they retire, 35 years later at 59, and then they die in 2024, 2050, yeah. They retire in 2059, then they die in 2083, and then their spouse dies 6 years later, then the account balance remaining after death goes to the beneficiaries. So you can see how that line works. Next, General Conference budget proposals. There are fewer United Methodist churches going into this General Conference than there were before. Disaffiliation has affected approximately and closing of churches has affected about 9,000 out of 31,000 congregations. That's much more heavily concentrated in some areas than other areas. Kind of what I call the Old South has by far the highest numbers of disaffiliations and highest percentages. But second to that is the South Central jurisdiction, and especially led by Texas. Sorry. we couldn't, the Longhorns couldn't win in the end, but boy, we lead in disaffiliations. That wasn't funny, but so 9,000 congregations fewer out of 31,000. The South Central jurisdiction, 41%, Southeastern jurisdiction, that Old South, 41% of the congregations left. South Central, it's 38%. Other jurisdictions, it ranges more like 13 to 25% of churches. So it was particularly impactful. The New Mexico Conference, 46 was the number at the close of the year, and that's about 37% of the congregations in New Mexico. This will have financial implications on at the general church level, as well as it has at the conference level and local church level. And so the budgets that had been prepared, in anticipation and trying to anticipate, what was going to happen in the future and everything, those have had to be adjusted and readjusted and readjusted. I think the current estimate is that the General Conference budget will be about 45% less than what it would have been if, 4 years ago or something. And so that's pretty significant. That affects several things at the general church level. It affects the general agencies and their funding. And you already see, if you've been keeping up, there's some bits of consolidation going on with the general boards. In a recent decision, the General Board of Global Ministries and the general secretary of that board is now the general secretary also of the Board of Higher Education and Ministry. And that's not a prediction of how those will relate in the future, but you can see the general boards beginning to respond in downsizing and facility use and those kinds of things. This also affects the number of bishops. And so the General Council in Finance and Administration has pretty strongly recommended that the U.S. not elect any further bishops in 2024. And there are formulas that are in the Book of Discipline, in the 2016 Book of Discipline, that give guidance to what qualifies for an episcopal area or for a jurisdiction, how many bishops they can have. And this is leading us into some more specific stuff about the South Central jurisdiction. South Central jurisdiction are those purple states. And so currently the South Central jurisdiction is being served by 8 bishops that there are 12 conferences in the South Central jurisdiction currently that are being served by 8 bishops and comprise 10 episcopal areas. Bishop Nunn, the bishop of the Oklahoma area, is going to be retiring, and that will bring to 7 the number of bishops in the South Central jurisdiction, which is what the discipline says the jurisdiction now qualifies for. So there'll be 1 fewer bishop in the South Central jurisdiction going forward. This has led to some pretty active conversations among the bishops in the College of Bishops in this jurisdiction, but also with the Jurisdictional Episcopacy Committee, which is the committee that determines that makes recommendation to Jurisdictional Conference about which are the areas, how many bishops, and eventually at Jurisdictional Conference, who goes where among bishops, right? So that's all going to be determined in July, finalized in July. But there's been some active conversations in just the last couple of weeks, and we'll see where it goes. But it's been with the College of Bishops and with that Committee on Episcopacy, and it's can we possibly kind of agree on some things before we get to Jurisdictional Conference, so some of the conferences can get to work on what their future relationships are going to be. So right now, one active conversation is that the Bishop of Arkansas would also be the Bishop of Oklahoma and the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. That the bishop who serves in the Dallas-Fort Worth area would become the bishop of one conference that's been moving toward uniting between North Texas, which is Dallas, Central Texas, which is Fort Worth, and the remnants of Northwest Texas Conference. Okay? Currently, officially on the books, the Episcopal area of New Mexico is the Northwest Texas, New Mexico area, right? When Bishop Bledsoe retired, and there were a couple of other bishop retirements, certain bishops who were already serving in one area then were asked to supervise other areas. And I was asked to serve from San Antonio to supervise New Mexico. I think that's been good and positive in so many ways. There's so many things that they have in common. There are close relationships. There are some things that make sense about that. I think that was set up as a temporary situation, and I was a little shocked, just to be honest with you, at the Jurisdictional Conference that was held in November of 2022, when we all learned what our assignments were. That I was pleased that I was going to be, serving New Mexico and Rio, Texas Conference again. But what they announced when they announced the bishops is, Bishop Sines will serve as bishop of the North Texas Conference, and he will serve as bishop of the Central Texas Conference. When it came to me, as Bishop Schnase is going to serve as bishop of the Rio, Texas Conference and offer coverage of the New Mexico Conference. So that's my official status. So here's the thing. In these recent conversations with the College of Bishops and the Committee on Episcopacy, based on some conversations I've had with a number of clergy in the conference, clergy and lay leaders, we had a group of 20, 22, 23 together a few weeks ago and spent a whole day together talking about the future of the conference and especially about some of these conversations about how Episcopal leadership will be provided. And so what I've been pushing for is greater self-determination by New Mexico, a greater sense of autonomy, and some arrangement that stops New Mexico perceiving itself as some stepchild to some other conference. Okay? So one of the things that's being actively discussed, and we'll see how the Committee on Episcopacy comes out on it, is that Rio, Texas is its own Episcopal area, and New Mexico is its own Episcopal area, but one bishop serves them both. Now that's for people who are kind of new to this conversation, what's the difference between a conference? What's the difference between an Episcopal area? And if you're really new to Methodism, you're saying, I thought the bishop was Methodist, why is he Episcopalian? The word Episcopal comes from the Greek episkopos. Scopus, like a scope, sight, epi, over. And so the Episcopal Church has bishops that give oversight. And it's from that the Methodist Church adopted the words Episcopal. So I have an Episcopal office in Albuquerque. I have an Episcopal office in San Antonio. There were other ways of looking at this puzzle. One is that Rio, Texas is a conference, New Mexico is a conference, but then the Episcopal area would be called the San Antonio area. Okay? So it does create a little bit different sense of self-determination to have New Mexico Episcopal area, Rio, Texas. It also affects how Episcopal offices are funded. So GCFA pays the bishop's salaries. The local annual conferences don't do that. But they also give certain financial support to each Episcopal office. So if we did the one bishop, two conferences, we just get one allotment of that, right? So by doing it this way, it means we'll keep there'll be 2 Episcopal offices, one in San Antonio, New Mexico. Now, these conversations have been rich, and I think we're coming to some agreements. There may be some announcements fairly soon about this. If any of the conferences involved really just can't accept the direction that's going, the actual decision about all this happens at Jurisdictional Conference in July. And so things, even if the Committee on Episcopacy or the College of Bishops says this is what we'd like to do, that can change at Jurisdictional Conference. So that's where that stands. I will say that the conversation I had a couple of weeks ago, and several of you in this room were a part of that, about the future of New Mexico was full of just a delightful energy. A great deal of active participation, talking about some possibilities for exploration in the future. And we've just got so many, we've got exactly the people resources, exactly the financial resources we need for this moment to fulfill what God is calling us to do now. And again, I just count it a privilege to serve as the bishop of your conference. And if it becomes an Episcopal area and I'm reassigned, I'll be happy to serve that as well. So another question that was asked at that gathering of pastors and lay people here in New Mexico a couple of weeks ago was, what were my intentions for retirement? Which I had to think about. I wonder how they want this to go. So I'm eligible to retire in 2024, but by the discipline, as far as when I max out on the time, it's 2028. And in the last several months, based on a lot of conversations here in New Mexico, as well as in Rio, Texas, as well as consulting the boss at home. And I'm not planning to retire in 2024. So.
But this question is about the financial impact of disaffiliated congregations on the New Mexico Annual Conference, and how has disaffiliation impacted our conference financially?
Sure. So I told you that I think 37% of the churches disaffiliated from the New Mexico Conference. Thus far, the calculations on apportionment impact from those churches leaving is about 33 to 34% on the budget. It isn't over, and I don't mean that we're anticipating more and more disaffiliations, but what has happened in this, as you may know from your own local church experience, is even churches that remained have lost some people, right? So we don't know how all that's going to take a little longer to figure out. Now, if you've kind of noticed some of the changes in the conference office and in the cabinet, you'll see that there's already been steps in anticipation of some of this that were taken all the way last year. So we moved from 3 district superintendents to 2 district superintendents, and we no longer have someone holding the position of provost. The 2 superintendents have divided up the responsibilities of the provost, and each of them lead various administrative or ministry functions that the provost formerly held. So we've got a great CFA, Council of Finance and Administration. John Nash is the current chair of it, and he knows his numbers, and he's been very just deliberate in how they think about the future there. So I don't know if that covers very much there, but we'll see budget changes here. Because of the way disaffiliation has worked, and because those disaffiliating churches in New Mexico have almost all met the obligations of the disaffiliation, which means they paid their present year's apportionments as well as the next year's apportionments. That means we've got this little time cushion of kind of prepaid apportionments that just gives us some time to think about what this might look like a little further down the road.
All right, Bishop, this is one that I think is a fun one to answer, actually. How will we take care of people left behind from churches that disaffiliated, and how can we help?
Okay. So many of the churches that disaffiliated, I mean, in honesty, almost all of them, but some impacted more than others, they voted to disaffiliate. They had to reach a 67% vote to do that. Sometimes that vote was 95% to disaffiliate. Sometimes it was like 68%, which means there's 30% of the congregation that did not want to leave. And even in some of the churches where it was at 95%, there are people that still want to remain United Methodist, or within that 95%, there was an environment created where people did not feel safe to vote against the disaffiliation, you know. So that leaves, it leaves United Methodist without a church in various places. Now, in Carlsbad, there's a pretty healthy group of people who've been meeting together, who've been looking toward the future, that have, started even, building a bank account and thinking about what this is going to look like as a church in the future. And so that's one of the better examples that we have. I think when we're making appointments this year, we're trying to figure out different possibilities here. And here I'm not talking about Carlsbad specifically, but sometimes there's a pastor assigned to a community that's a remaining United Methodist, a congregation, but it's near some churches that have disaffiliated and are leaving United Methodists that want to remain. And we're kind of thinking, what if we work something out with that pastor who was the pastor at that main little hub church, but also offered pastoral leadership to some of those smaller communities. Many of our churches have also been gracious in reaching out to people who they know from other churches in town and inviting them into their communities of faith. And Ross, you've been on the front lines of some of these conversations. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I wasn't listening. No, not really. It's really an encouraging thing when you go, especially with that group in Carlsbad and the group in Hobbs. I'm emailing with them quite a bit. In fact, there's a woman who has ties to Central, Karen Hobbs, who lives in Hobbs, who is in the process of helping get a group going down there and of faithful remnant from the United Methodist churches in Hobbs. And so our new church development team is working hard and fast to find support for them and get them the kinds of things that they need to be able to bring a United Methodist Wesleyan expression, or to keep a United Methodist Wesleyan expression in those towns.
Yeah. No, that's good. Why don't you go ahead and read the next?
Okay. Is there currently a path to disaffiliation? Can churches still disaffiliate?
So paragraph 2553, which was adopted at the 2019 General Conference. Now remember the context I just gave of the voting in favor of the traditionalist plan that had more restrictive and punitive language in it, okay? Not only did we need to care about what happens if churches leave, but actually what people thought might happen is progressive churches would be leaving, okay? And that did happen in some places. But whether it was progressive or conservative, what 2553 said is you must meet these requirements, and then the Conference Board of Trustees sets the more particular and detailed plan for each conference. That 2553 was only meant to help the 2019 General Conference to make it to 2020, okay? Because then something else, then we'd look at other solutions and everything. 2020, COVID, and that General Conference was canceled. So because it was expected to just serve for a short while, it had an expiration date that was December 31st of 2023. So 2553 can no longer be used. Different conferences have responded differently to that. The Rio, Texas conference just decided in terms of our practice, as we're getting out of the disaffiliation business at the cabinet level, because it was consuming DS's time and eating up their energy all the time. So while there will be a way in that conference for churches to leave the United Methodist Church, it will be using a different paragraph, 2549, and the DS won't be involved with it. We'll have a retired pastor work with that church. In the New Mexico conference, there's also been work with our trustees here about, is there a way to leave? It requires some a little bit different steps, but also all those requirements that were in the disaffiliation process before the end of the year would have to, all those obligations would have to be met. So there is a way of doing that. What I would hope, though, and this is, what does it mean to be United Methodist today? To me, to hear that someone's United Methodist does not tell me whether they're progressive or centrist or conservative. To be committed to the United Methodist Church today says, even though I'm progressive, even though I'm centrist, even though I'm conservative, and there are others who see things differently, I'm committed to belonging to a church where we can work together without all having to agree on things, right? It's, can you tolerate, can you coexist in a denomination where people down the road at a different church can offer ministries that you yourself would not be inclined to offer? So I'm hoping that whatever General Conference does, we're not seeing another bunch of churches that want to leave. I hope they would feel secure enough, if they're more conservative than progressive, to want to belong to a church where even if you're not progressive, you can live with the fact that other people are.
You want another question?
Sure.
All right, I'm encouraged by this one, especially judging by the average age in this room. How are our youth or young people programs being affected by this split, our Wesleys, our youth groups? Do you have any sense of that, Bishop?
Again, that's one where, Ross, you may have a better, more accurate take on that. It just varies so much church by church. I mean, I've been listening at some of the good things that are happening here at Central with college-age students, and that's there's every reason to be enthusiastic that this is moving in a healthy direction. I think, well, there are churches where that had a large number of young people, and they may have disaffiliated, and there are churches that remain, that have good youth ministries. One of the things in the demographic study of the churches that have disaffiliated as compared to those that are remaining, there's been all kinds of things out on media that say, well, it was the growing churches that left and the dying churches that stayed. It was the big, strong churches that left and the small churches that stayed. It was the young churches that left, and it's the old churches. Well, you know what? When they carefully break down all those numbers, the demographics for the churches that left in terms of size and age and number of new members over the last few years, the growth pattern, they're the same. Like there's 2% difference between how many small churches remain and how many small churches left and so forth. So the only major impact demographically is a very noticeable pattern of the disaffiliating churches being more white Anglo and leaving at a higher percentage than Hispanic churches, African American churches, or Native American. Only 5% of Native American churches disaffiliated is compared to something like 15%, I want to say, African American, a couple percentage more Hispanic, and then 29% white Anglo.
Bishop, this question is about annual conference. Are you anticipating any decisions that would be important happening at annual conference this year?
So I'm taking it one day at a time, right? We've got the annual conference planning team that has been working on some really creative themes. We're going to have some interesting guest speakers. One of those is going to be the General Secretary of the General Board of Archives and History. Will's clapping right there. It's like he's been waiting his whole career for. Now, you might think, why are we going to, at a time like this, going to dig out old parchment things and talk about the. So then, the General Secretary of Archives and History is a young woman, I think PhD in her lower 30s, and is an extraordinarily compelling speaker. And I've heard her speak on a few occasions, and she's going to tell us some things about New Mexico that probably we didn't even know ourselves. And then she's going to talk about what Methodism really was like in its founding and through its history, both some of the more negative parts, but also some of that core identity of who we are and how we serve. So that's some of what's going to go on at annual conference. As far as major decisions, there are people that have asked, well, if you have just 2 superintendents, are you going to have just 2 districts? Or we almost want to keep this simple right now, and because when you start changing district lines, then other things, you have to think about, and it gets complicated. So right now we don't see any of those kind of structural changes. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything big.
Sacramento, maybe?
Sacramento. We've had some excellent representatives from the New Mexico Conference, including our chancellor, meeting regularly with some of the board members of Sacramento and talking about the future and what the United Methodist relationship may be. I don't want to get into those details right now because that's still in pretty active conversation, but they're working on an agreement that if it all works out would come to annual conference.
Since we're having 2020 General Conference in 2024, are we going to have 2024 General Conference in 2026?
So there are some members of the Council of Bishops who want to have a 2026 General Conference, but not in the regular legislative ways, but in some ways to help launch the U.S. Regional Conference, and to also just work on ministry areas that are not just the usual, all the petitions and all the legislative things. So it'd be a shortened one. I don't have a clear picture what that would look like. The Council of Bishops has talked about that, but they have not put out a call for 2026. Also, and someone's probably going to correct me on this, I'm thinking of Judicial Council rulings recently. But so the question came up, like exactly that one, because of the way the discipline is written about general conferences every quadrennium and everything. Do we have to squeeze another one in before we get to 2028? And I think they finally ruled that we don't have to. So what it would take to have one in 2026 is a called session by the bishops. And
that's all, Bishop.
okay. You've been kind and generous to sit this long for this. I believe you're here because you love the church, you love Christ, and you're concerned about the future of the United Methodist Church, and you're curious and interested, and that binds us all together. So again, as I said earlier, I give God thanks for every one of you, and for all that you do for the purposes of Christ and for the United Methodist Church. You're exactly what we need to respond to God's calling to us in this moment. God bless you. It's a privilege to serve as your bishop.